Okay. Okay, so Carl's in one piece. All right, we are ready to roll. We are back in the study of the Sermon on the Mount. We're still in Matthew chapter 5. But we are going to change gears this morning and starting in verse 17. And we want to do our best, and this is one part of the Sermon on the Mount, which we would say there's not much practical use for, but it is a necessary part because Jesus is going to talk about the old law and his relationship to it, and it's going to be something that we are very interested in. And let's see if our thing is working. Let's slide it up here. Okay, so Jesus has been, and of course this is the longest sermon recorded in the New Testament by Jesus. And so there's a lot of different stuff to cover. We covered the Beatitudes, we covered the in between topics between 13 and 16 last week. And now he's going to enter another area. And he's going to talk about the law of Moses, or the old law, his relationship to it. And it's a very good study for us because it lets us tackle a related subject, which is sometimes difficult. And let's just start by reading no problem, I don't mind. My back is good enough that I can bend down there and press a button. Okay. And let's just start by reading what Jesus has to say here. Starting in verse 17. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. And fulfill is going to be the key word of the day. For surely, verse 18, I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass away from the law, till all is, what's our key word? Fulfilled. Verse 19, whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. All right, so we have this blob of a subject matter dealing with the law, and what are we going to do with it? And so let's just try to tackle what Jesus is doing here. First thing that every speaker does is to establish credibility. What does that mean? Even comedians do this. They establish credibility.
They share their resume.
They share their resume, okay, one way to put it. Well, they're standing in front of you just like I'm doing right now. Just like there's a button. Anyways, they stand in front of you and they're speaking. And what do they want from the crowd? What do they want from the listeners? Pardon? Okay, they want response. They want you to be listening. And where's the credibility come in? Where's the credibility come in? Come on, we've all done this in school. Can we all remember our school years? I remember a nephew of mine. He was startled to find out that in college, the college instructors did not have to have a teaching degree. They just had to know their subject. And my nephew said, well, that's why they're so terrible at teaching. And what it was that, credibility means, the saying, well, we have a verse for it. Turn to the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 7. Verses 28 and 29. And so it was when Jesus had ended these sayings, this is the end of the Sermon on the Mount, that the people were astonished at his teaching. Okay, they're surprised, they're astonished at his teaching. Why? Verse 29. Why were they astonished at his teaching? He taught as one having authority. What's that mean?
Respected, I know what you're talking about.
Right, there you go. And that's the key phrase there. He knew what he was talking about. And how long does it take for people to pick up on whether a speaker actually knows what he's talking about? Not long. Usually not long at all. And so Jesus is establishing credibility. And for him to establish credibility, he has to deal with this subject of the law. Why is that? Notice his questions there. His statement in verse 17. I did not come to destroy, to fulfill. He's talking about the law, the prophets. I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass away from the law till all is fulfilled. What's this doing to Jesus' credibility by what he says? What's Jesus doing about his own credibility? He's establishing they should listen to him. They believe in the law, and therefore, Jesus is linking himself to the law. He's not this new, strange kind of thing here. But they should listen to him because he is, he's, to use the word, he is fulfilling. Now, we have questions, and I can remember sitting right here in this auditorium 50 years ago and wondering about this verse. Well, what's Jesus mean by this? You mean we're under the law of Moses? I struggled with this. Well, how do we? Because Jesus says, how long is it going to last? Right here. What's he say? Right. Well, no. Okay, earth and heaven, till one jot or one tittle are not going to pass till something happens. I mean, if we're all still under the old law, things are going to change, right? Okay, but the key word, what's our key word? Verse 17 and verse 18. All is fulfilled. So let's do a little cart before the horse stuff and turn to the end of Luke. It's actually at the bottom of your study sheet. Luke 24:44. Jesus has died, risen from the grave. And so these are some of his last words to the disciples. And What does he say in verse 44? These are the words which I spoke to you while I was with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which are written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me. And there it is. He is stuck around, so everything about him was fulfilled. And again, that's one of our key words. So we know the door was open towards the, what we'll call the Christian faith, whatever, the Christian system. I put it on your sheet as number 7. What key phrases from the following verses show we are under a new law, the law of Christ? So, are we still under the law of Moses? No. Okay, we're not under the law of Moses. And the reason was because everything was fulfilled that Jesus talked about. And so now we have the beginning of this, this new relationship with God through the disciples, and of course through the church, everything else. But this is very important. I mean, when I was a teenager, I was really scratching my head about this. You mean we're still under the law of Moses? We're going to bring some cows in next week and have a sacrifice, whatever. And the answer to that is no. Jesus fulfilled everything that was said about him in the old law, the law of Moses. And so now we have this new system. Now let's go back to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, and let's answer some of these questions. He establishes his credibility by linking himself to the law of Moses. Then he gets into, what indicates how great a person is. Verse 19. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and who's the least? Who is the greatest and who's the least, according to verse 19?
Those that obey will be the greatest.
There you go. And remember, when Jesus says this, as far as establishing credibility and also establishing context, which we'll get to in a second, but who is Jesus talking to in the Sermon on the Mount for the most part? Jews. Yes. He's talking to Jews, and so a lot of this stuff is going to be directly connected to the Jews, and then it throws out the doormat to the rest of the chapter, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times Jesus is going to compare, what was said in old times. And then he's going to say, but I say unto you. So you can see how this connects with what he is talking about here in verses 17 through 20. So Jesus informs them of this, and then we're going to go someplace else just to draw a comparison. Let's turn to Matthew 23 and verse 23. And if you want a chapter where Jesus gets really harsh with the scribes and Pharisees, religious leaders of the day, go to Matthew 23. And one of his phrases that he likes to use is found in the beginning of verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! And here's one of the reasons for that woe is you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. these ought you to have done without leaving the others undone. And what is the point in Matthew 23? What were the Jewish leaders doing?
They were wrapped up in legal matters of minor situations instead of being leaders of faith.
Okay, I understand, I'm sure that you talked about this before. What does they're paying tithe of mint and anise and cumin? By the way, what's the proper way to say that?
Human.
Thanks. And what's the significance of using those three things? Mint, anise, cumin. Okay, they're all enhancers. They're all spice-related things, stuff you would add to foods. What about the weight? Weightier matters. Are they heavy? Okay, so they're extremely light, and yet the Jewish leaders are worried that you are not tithing enough of your spices. And so, and Jesus is drawing the ridiculousness of this. So you're doing this. By the way, he doesn't say it's wrong for them to be tithing, counting their spices and giving a tenth to the temple. But he's making sure that they understand that this is not as important as some other things. And what are the three important things?
Justice, mercy, and faithfulness.
Okay, here it is. And you want to know what's really important, what you should really be spending your time on? The Jewish leaders, well, this is it. And so the justice, mercy, and faith is something worthy of your greater attentions and greater, greater deciphering about whether you have it in your life or not. And what do you all think? Do you think this is still true today? Do you think this is still our challenge today? Yes. Justice, mercy, and faith. And, there are some interesting things about these. Number one, justice. What is justice? Our country is settled on discussions on this subject. Whether people are receiving justice. We're not receiving justice from the King of England. Because of the laws that they made, they dumped the tea into the water and all that. But it's still true with all of us in our everyday lives. We want justice, and yet our view of justice is what? A lot of times. Our view of justice is...
Bias.
Pardon?
Bias.
Bias. Yes. I want justice for me. That may not mean justice for you. But as long as I get justice for me, we're okay. Is that what Jesus means by justice? No. So it's a little harder to put our finger on, and certainly a little harder to put into practice than the second thing, mercy. Same kind of thing. We want mercy, but who's it start with? Us. I want mercy for me. Susan and I love watching courtroom shows and all this, and this has been happening for ever since the beginning of our country. But can one man truly be trusted to make these decisions? The lawyers in a big city, they're thinking, well, we're gonna establish this court suit, but then they start talking about, well, yes, we need to do this, but we want to make sure that we go to Judge Smith over here. Why?
He's more favorable to your argument.
Right. He's more favorable, and they know this. Okay, so out the door goes any kind of justice and mercy. And it's, it's a real shame. People can't be trusted. Our political climate today, has anything changed? Is there still bias out there? Yeah. And so, it is a troubling thing. And then this third of the three tenets, justice, mercy, and faith. Having faith. And why would that be so important?
If you lose sight of faith, you lose sight of the other stuff.
Yeah. I mean, faith is kind of like the nail on the head. It's the thing that is going to affect all the other things. And so, again, we have these three things. And so Jesus, and you can come back to Matthew chapter 5. When we look at what Jesus is trying to emphasize here, it comes down to this. It comes down to making sure that we do the best we can. Well, let's start with the Jews. Make sure that the Jews do the best they can. They have the law of Moses, and what's their number one goal with that relationship? What's their number one goal with the relationship with the law?
Keep it.
Okay, just obey it. It's pretty simple, but of course, like a lot of things, it sounds simple, and it is not. And so, then we look at this. We have to, and I'm glad this 17 through 20 forces us to look at this subject matter, and that is the subject of context. Well, are we, like I said, I go back to my teenage years, reading it, having Elmer recite it from the pulpit. I'm sitting there thinking, this can't be. Is this what we're under? Are we under the law of Moses anymore? And so we have to say, well, there's context involved here. We already started by answering the question, which is, who is Jesus talking to here? He's talking to the Jews. And so this subject matter, this is the time of Christ, this is the time of the Jewish leadership and all of that. And so, so we're not in that passage. We're not in, Christians today are not in this passage, so to speak. And what is context? What is context? You're studying along in your Bible, you read something that really sounds strange. One of the first things you have to do in trying to figure out what it's talking about is the context. So what is the context of any passage?
Context is really what's going on at that point in time.
Okay,
And who is involved?
right. All of the elements, come together, when, the basic questions that you learned in elementary school, who, what, where, when, how, all of that. You have to answer those questions before you can come to a conclusion about what a particular passage is addressing. And so, and that's especially true here with verses 17 through 20 of Matthew chapter 5. And so we look at this and we ask ourselves, some of these questions, and we just try to figure it out. Now, if you are somebody who likes, sometimes we just like the preacher to tell us stuff. And that's good. Is that good? Is it
Yeah.
good for you just to, I just want the guy to tell me what it means? Well, it's good in saying that you trust your preacher, but what if your preacher isn't worth trusting?
I wouldn't even say so much if the preacher isn't worth trusting. Like, we all get things wrong. There's sometimes that we can misunderstand certain things, again, out of context.
It's,
I think it can be overcomplicated.
right,
Sometimes it's just what it says and it's
Right.
pretty plain and we try to make it more difficult than it is.
just do it. And really, that's what Jesus is saying here in verse 19 and 20. And, just do it. Just obey the law of Moses, and everything will be good. If you, let's just read verse 20 again. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. That's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about the Jewish leaders. And Jesus is saying, well, guess what, folks? You need to go beyond that and, start thinking for yourself about what this law, this written law, has to say. So, question 7 at the bottom of the outline, we'll try to get into some of these verses to show there's going to be a change from the time of Jesus in Matthew chapter 5 until the time of his death, burial, and resurrection. And so let's just begin. Hebrews chapter 7 and verses 18 and 19. By the way, if you want to look at the passages in the New Testament that give you the most detail about the change in the covenants from old law to new law, from the law of Moses to the law of Christ, these books, book of Hebrews, book of Romans, book of Galatians, and of course Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But these books especially will be helpful to you. All right, Hebrews chapter 7, 18 and 19. For on the one hand, there is an annulling of the former commandment because of its weakness and unprofitableness. For the law made nothing perfect. On the other hand, there is the bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. So what do we get? What do we get with the law of Christ? How does it compare to the old law of Moses? What are the comparison words that are used here by the Hebrew writer? The bringing in of what? Bringing in of a better hope. Again, he compares the old law. The law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, there is the bringing in of a better hope through which we draw near to God. So definitely a difference there. Okay, Hebrews chapter 10 and verses 9 and 10. Hebrews chapter 10 and verses 9 and 10. Which is even more direct, in my opinion. Then he said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first law. He takes away the first that he may establish the second. By that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. So, because of Christ, Jesus takes away the one, and how does he refer to the second? To establish the second. And of course, now we know why Jesus is saying, it's not going to happen until all is fulfilled. In other words, his death, burial, and resurrection. But again, it is, just a simple to me understanding of how this is. We're not under the law of Moses anymore. We're under the law of Christ. It's better, provides a better hope for us, and this is what it's all about. Okay? More questions yet? Okay, Ephesians 2:13 through 16. Ephesians 2, let's start with verse 12. Let's read 12 and 13. Ephesians 2, 12 and 13. Okay, so he's talking to the Ephesians, understanding context. Who are the Ephesians? Is he in Judea? Is he just outside of Jerusalem? No, he's talking to these Christians, and of course they are a mixed bunch. There's a lot of Jewish Christians in among them, but basically he's, when he's talking to these people, he's talking to Gentiles. But he says in verse 12 that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no promise and without God in the world. So this is where the anybody who wasn't a Jew was before the coming of Christ. So they are in a hopeless, and by the way, I should say we are in a hopeless situation, but everything changed for the better. Verse 19 or verse 13. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by what? Brought near by the blood of Christ. So, the sun rises, the S-O-N, and he has opened the door for us to be in this much better place in the sight of God. Okay? Colossians 2:14. And let's read a few more verses of this. Colossians 2, starting in verse 11. Paul the Apostle wrote this letter to the people of Colossae, Church of Colossae, and in verse 11, he's talking about Christ. He says, in him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you also were raised with him through faith in the working of God who raised him from the dead, and you, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses. Okay, so the great promises there. And then this one further thing, verse 14, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, which was contrary to us, and he has taken it away, having nailed it to the cross. Now the reason this passage is so important, it gives us a time period. Well, when was the law of Moses taken out of the way? And when's the exact time that Paul says in verse 14? What did he do? Okay, nailed it, took it out of the way, nailed it to the cross. So when that happened, then we have the grand blessing open to us of being Christians, of obeying the gospel of Christ, obeying the law of Christ, Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2, and being able to just live as a Christian and to live simply. Now, we understand, of course, there can be difficulties in understanding this. There can be, we can have questions, as I had many over the years, and so we get to this point where, okay, what's it all mean? And yes, it does take some thought, and especially, and here's the way I do Bible study. I'm studying along, and what makes me stop? Why do I stop reading? Because we know, if you're a daily Bible reader, and you're trying to, you have a goal, you want to read, say, to the end of Psalms today or whatever, And so you're thinking, well, that's my goal, but is that really our goal? What's our goal in reading our Bibles?
Understanding.
Understanding. If we don't comprehend it, what they call that stuff back in elementary school, SRA? Am I the only person who ever took the SRA courses? Susan and I are the only ones that had these little color folders that had stories in them, and it was supposed to, make sure that you comprehended stuff. Anyways, in a way, that's how we ought to be reading the Bible. We read, and then you come across something you don't understand. Well, you better, do some extra looking around and reading and so forth to make sure that you do understand that. And by the way, I'm not averse. Is that the right word? I'm not against, somebody calling me if they have a problem. I've been called a million times over the years, but that's good. That's what we're all here for. And so, it all is coming down to, getting back to what Jesus is talking about in Luke chapter 5, or Matthew chapter 5. It's about, our relationship with God, the law that God has given us. Do we understand it? And the last great thing which Jesus emphasizes there in Matthew 5, 19 and 20 is, are we obeying it? Just being an obedient Christian, which we'll talk about in the sermon a little bit this morning. And so, these, we can, of course, one of the reasons why we have Bible class every week is so that we can talk about these matters. It's for the benefit of us all to understand and to put them into practice. Okay, any questions, any suggestions how we can make sure that we are obeying properly? Are we actually understanding properly? Because there are questions that we could have based on the fact that there is not much information on a given subject. You take about 4 or 5 years ago, I was asked to teach the book of Revelation. And I've never been too thrilled about teaching the book of Revelation. That sounds bad. But one of the reasons is because Revelation is very difficult, and because even amongst, good-hearted, sincere preachers, what do you think? Do you think all good-hearted, sincere preachers agree with what Revelation is talking about? No, they don't. And so, what that means for me in my studies is, well, okay, I will do an intense study of Revelation, as intense as I can get in my head. But, there is going to be some stuff that I'm going to have to go over, and there's going to be decisions that I will have to make as teachers that don't agree with other preachers. And so I sifted through. I came down with and this is just amongst Church of Christ preachers. I came down with 5 avenues of interpreting Revelation by different preachers of the gospel. And then you just have to boil it all down, ask some questions. What's the timeline? When is Revelation? What time is it talking about? And so you have to go through all of that. And if that inspires you to want to study it further, maybe we will sometime. It is interesting. I enjoyed it. But it's a little bit difficult. We get into some of these big subjects that affect the church today. Premillennialism is probably the #1 subject that has come out of a study of Revelation, which has affected Christians in the Lord's church today. Hopefully not here, but it has done some harsh things to some brethren. And so we want to be very careful with this and any other subject. It always comes back to what Jesus is talking about here in Matthew chapter 5, and that is, just make sure that we get the law right, and then we get obedience right, and we start putting it into practice. Anybody want to make a comment or two before we finish for today? Okay. And it's interesting. It's interesting to me how congregations differ. Some places that I preach, the subject of revelation and interpretation and especially all of this this stuff in Revelation. Some congregations they're really interested in that. They just like to study it, whereas other ones are kind of like how I've been for most of my life, which is let's be a little bit more careful with this and handle it the right way. Okay. Well, it's time. And then next week, we'll get back into the practical stuff. The first subject is going to be murder and hatred and all that stuff that we love to talk about. You've heard that has been said. What are we going to do with what Jesus says? Okay, thank you.